The singer out of Slipknot went to Rome to see the Pope. The singer out of Slipknot went to Rome to see the Pope. The singer out of Slipknot went to Rome to see the Pope, and the Pope said to his aide.
And welcome to episode number 18 of the For All That podcast. Joining us again, a returning guest this week, we have Natalie McGarry, who's a political blogger and is running to be the SNP candidate for a member of the European Parliament. So welcome, Natalie. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Good morning, chaps. Thanks for having me back on. Looking forward to some good debate this morning.
And joining Natalie in our good debate is rather unwell Michael Greenwell from his miasma of pestilence. How are you getting on, Michael? Has the plague got you?
Yeah, it is. And my advice is basically, if you feel something coming on Friday night, don't go for a 12-mile cycle on Saturday morning.
Good advice every day of the year, frankly.
I'm going to have to be the grumpy one in the corner this week with the occasional interjection.
Okay, so it'll be much like usual then. In that case.
Oh, but I'll start with an interjection, sorry, because I thought the most outrageous thing happened this week, and I'm going to give you it with a metaphor. Imagine, right, so there's probably going to be about 600 people listening to this, and then there's yourself and Natalie. Imagine a burglar comes to our house, right, takes all our stuff, gets the money and bets it all on a horse, and loses it all, and then is in financial trouble because he also bet some other stuff that he didn't really have, and he has to be bailed out, and then we, us three, and all of the listeners have to chip in 10%. Welcome to Cyprus. Don't you think it's absolutely outrageous?
Yeah, I've been kind of going on this week actually because I have a particular interest in Cyprus. Anyway, patently outrageous. I saw today that the UK government are planning to pay back any monies taken from British persons who are working for the government in Cyprus. So obviously that's an issue for the UK government as well. But I mean, it's a wider issue about the euro, and what powers people have over personal banking account. I mean, there's huge issues there, and I think it's 6.5%. Just to correct you, unless you have savings over £100,000, Michael.
Not last time I checked, no.
Really?
That's
I thought you would be sitting there with reserves that could bail out the Royal Bank of Scotland.
Awkward. Well, Natalie, just to pick up something you said there, why are you particularly interested in Cyprus?
Well, I spent time there working as a holiday rep of all things in the early 2000s, and it shaped my interest academically with regards the kind of political situation in Cyprus, with the uncomfortable fact of living in military occupation in the northern part of Cyprus, and so that shaped what I went forward to study in international government diplomacy. So yeah, I'm particularly interested. But I mean, this isn't just a Cyprus story. This is a Europe story, and a cautionary tale about the influence that Europe and the banking sector can have, and the way that Europe can impose very draconian punishment on ordinary people for decisions that were made completely out with their control. It's very, very concerning, and I would echo Michael on that.
And the UK government doesn't even want to put even the littlest bit of amelioration on the was it 200% bonuses for bankers? So we can't be having that. No.
Yeah, Natalie, what do you think about that? I mean, obviously you are hoping to be one of the 6 candidates that the SNP will nominate to become members of the European Parliament, and there are 2 at the moment. I mean, obviously, when we talk about Europe at the moment, we talk quite a lot about debt, about regulation, about banking. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, what would you think you could possibly bring to the table in terms of that discussion? It's perhaps a difficult question.
Well, it's quite difficult because the media like to frame Europe as being a single issue Eurozone. And I mean, we're not currently part of the Eurozone. Obviously, the decisions that are made there affect us all in terms of financial aspects and cutbacks in the European budget, etc. But I mean, I think for me, Europe is about much more than just a banking sector or the Eurozone. It's about commonality and cohesion and working across Europe in the interests of everybody in Europe. And I like Europe. I have issues with Europe. I'm sure you're both aware that, I think there are huge issues of transparency democracy, etc. But on the whole, I like the shared common purpose and the free movement of peoples. And a lot of the stuff that's come out of Europe, and some of the best things that have come out of the UK government while Labour were in power, have come out of the social chapter, a working time directive, etc. So there are a lot of things that have happened in Europe that, kind of go unmentioned in the UK press because they're always looking for the kind of negative on it. And I think it's an agenda issue. So.
Yeah, no, I think. I mean, what I study, you see quite similar vacillations of interest and quite strong agenda-led reporting in terms of particularly kind of human rightsy kind of things.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a nice moment of transition there, since we're talking about the press, to move on to the topic of the regulation of the press. Because this week on Friday, Lord McCluskey, who was a Labour Solicitor General, and was subsequently a judge in the Court of Session, made his report, along with several others, to the Scottish ministers about Scottish press regulation, because regulation of the press is not a reserved matter under the Scotland Act, so Holyrood does have powers that it can exercise, and McCluskey and et al. Were kind of charged with considering what to do in Scotland about the Leveson proposals. And obviously next week in the House of Commons they'll be having a vote about what kind of structure they might adopt in England and Wales. Should it be a royal charter? Should it be a more systematic statutory underpinning? And I think several people were quite shocked by what McCluskey proposed. He proposed that there be no opt-in, no optional regulation, no optional independent regulation of the press in Scotland, but everybody who was a news-related publisher of material would be covered by press regulation. And in his draft bill that he attached to his report, this is an amazingly wide compass. Any relevant publisher would be anybody who published any news-related material, including information, comment, or gossip on public affairs, published either in print or on electronic means of any sort, which would mean that I think we three would be covered by it. All of us bloggers would have to report and be regulated by the Scottish Government's regulator. And also anybody on Twitter who posted any thoughts about contemporary affairs in Scotland would be caught by it. And anybody who lived abroad but addressed a specifically Scottish audience would be caught by the Scottish Government's regulation. Now, the Scottish Government, and Alex Salmond in particular, have answered this report in a pretty tepid kind of way, and I don't necessarily expect to see it on the statute book. But I find this a pretty concerning, rather, outrageous proposition from Lord McCluskey, with no sensibility at all for the realities of contemporary electronic communication. I don't know, on that summary, Michael, what you think about that. Does that seem an attractive model of regulation for you? Do you want to feel the hand of the state on your shoulder telling you what to blog about?
It's somewhat draconian, isn't it? But the law is the interesting part on this. Wouldn't, for example, you're on Blogspot, I'm on WordPress, but they're not sites that are hosted in Scotland. So how can the law be extended to cover that? Can I just ask you that first?
Practically, that they simply intend to, that it's not about hosting. So, like I was saying, that if you publish material which is addressed towards a specific Scottish audience, however we work that out, I imagine I would be covered because most of my blogs tend to be about Scottish law or politics, then it would be considered to be a Scottish publication for the purposes of the regulator. But it is, as you're saying, it's an extraterritorial effect potentially there. And it could be very, very wide in compass. I mean, there's a Love and Garbage, the legal blogger, was posting yesterday about a case called Terence Ewing, I think, against the Times, where a guy who'd been defamed by the Times took two separate trips, one to Belfast and one to Edinburgh. And when he got off the train or off the boat, he went to the local library and downloaded a copy of the Times, including the article which he alleged had defamed him, and then immediately started legal actions in both Northern Ireland and in Scotland relating to his defamation. And actually, the possibility for very similar kind of interpretation of this in terms of Scottish publication, Scottish regulation, is, I think, something not to be sniffed at. Natalie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I haven't read the full McCluskey report, only the edited highlights. I think some of the response to it has been typically hysterical in the media, in the sense that obviously the planned proposals to me are very concerning, but they aren't Scottish Government, well, they aren't SNP policy. The the Scottish Government haven't said that they're going to enact them. So I think we need to have a bit of a mature, responsible conversation about it. To me, it seems as though they have been somewhat cobbled together. And I think David Torrance made an interesting point on this morning's Sunday Politics show, Scotland, about the fact that they weren't, McCluskey's report wasn't a reaction to what is required in Scotland in terms of regulation of the press, but it was a reaction to Leveson. And I think that's quite important, because it wasn't really taking on board what needs to be done, what regulations, if any, need to be put in Scotland, but was, from the very outset, meant to be more draconian than Leveson. I think that was an interesting point. Certainly, I don't know whether or not Lord McCluskey, and he's obviously a very accomplished lawyer, etc., judge, but I'm not sure how familiar he is with the wideness and the extent of online interactions, blogging, etc. It's not even workable, whether it's desirable or not, which in my opinion it's not, but it's not I don't think it's workable or practicable either.
What's happened to the principle of simple, the Americans get many things wrong, but they do have correct, the simple right to free speech. You cannot be arrested for saying anything. This is not talking about arrest, it's talking about regulation, but there should be the simple right to say what you like. I don't see the problem with that. I don't see why we just can't have that blanket law in Britain as well, or Scotland.
Yeah, I agree with you in the main part, Michael. I think part of my problem with the press is, and it's not something I would legislate against, or put in draconian rules and regulations. I think the press has to be more responsible. That's absolutely undoubtable and irrefutable. But I mean, I don't particularly. I think they've got to be responsible in what they report and what is deemed to be acceptable for public commentary. I mean, personally, I'm not interested in people conducting affairs. I don't think it's in the public interest to publish it. It's the only people that are of interest are those conducting the affair and the people it direct effects on. And so I think that newspapers and commentary have a responsibility to themselves and to readers to self-regulate what they deem acceptable to put in the public spectrum.
I think just to go back a wee step, Natalie, and to pick up something you were saying there about the evidence base for this, I think that's absolutely right, the point that David Torrance was making. And if you go back to the Motorman report, which was a report conducted by the Information Commissioner, in the early 2000s, middle 2000s, I think, which was about the illegal traffic in data and the use of journalists of illegally acquired sources of data for the purposes of news reporting, that actually one of the really striking and consistent features about this is that Scotland is not disaggregated. In all of this data, Scotland isn't paid attention to specifically. The Leveson inquiry was fundamentally, I think, about Fleet Street. And yes, you had one or two Scottish witnesses. You had Stephen House, the new Chief Constable for Scotland, talking about various things. But actually, Scotland was a sideline in all of that, and that's probably fine in the context of an overstretched inquiry whose terms of reference are far too big anyway. But as a consequence of which, we really don't know about what extent some of the most problematic illegal practices that were going on in Fleet Street may have been going on in Scotland. And so to sort of immediately decide that what a response to this, as yet shapeless, possibly very minor problem in Scotland, all we should do is introduce whole-scale regulation of all electronic and print news publishers and commenters. It's just outrageous. What I find worrying and sort of almost absurd is just how cavalier the sort of assertion that this should be introduced appears to have been. I mean, I admit it a bit extreme, but when recommending and so welcoming this report, thanking Lord McCluskey for his efforts, I think Salmon described it as a very thorough piece of work. Totally inaccurate. It's a totally patchy, rather, there's no evidence base here for this report. And I just find the cavalier assumption that regulation is the answer, that we need to regulate more, just very dispiriting. And with my kind of liberal hat on, I just can't really understand how you could propose such proposals.
No, I think maybe it comes from what you alluded to in the question. It might be a generational problem, without meaning to be rude. He's kind of an older man. He's not of the generation of, like the internet, the blogosphere, and these kind of things. And